again to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, integrity deficit disorder. Today we have as our guest Elizabeth Benedict, author of Rewriting Illness, A View of My Own. That's your book, A View of Your Own. So, are you there, Elizabeth?
I am here. Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I'd like to find, if I could, the information that I've been given. And other than that, I looked at Amazon and so forth, and you got some great reviews, which is, I guess, it's easy to be a storytelling artistry because it's a knack. If you've noticed in the past when you were like in junior high, you were gonna look at your talent.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I had much of a storytelling talent in junior high school, but when I was in college, I had a profound experience. I was a literature student, and I took a course in the modern English novel, and I wrote a paper about a Victorian novel called The Way of All Flesh. And I asked the teacher if I could write a personal paper, and this was the 1970s. It was a very different time, and he said I could. And I ended up writing about how I connected with the sorrow and the abuse that this character in this novel had endured. And I ended up writing about my father. And it was a ridiculous thing to do because it was a literature course at Columbia University. But the teacher wrote an amazing comment and said, I can see you want to write a novel, and I think you should, and you're a really good writer, and I want you to go on and do this. And that changed my life. And I hadn't really felt that before, but that changed the whole direction of my life.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. So I don't think that I'm not sure. I always wrote when I was a kid, but I never had that kind of validation.
Right.
So
you have a number of books then?
This is my 8th book that I've written, as they say, all by myself, but I've edited many other books. I edited 3 volumes of essays on topics that I was interested in, but I've written 5 novels. I wrote a book about how to write sex scenes in literary fiction that's been in print for 25 years. And I edited 3 books of essays by a lot of interesting, famous people. Guess one of my favorites was I asked a bunch of interesting women to talk about a favorite gift from their mothers. And I was obsessed with a scarf I got from my mother. And I sort of could describe my whole relationship with my mother through this scarf. And I asked 30 other women if they had a gift like that. And that became a collection called What My Mother Gave Me. So I do a lot of storytelling now. And I also work with kids on their college essays. So I help other people write stories all the time.
Right. I saw the part where writing sex, is that a part that I saw in terms of?
Well, I wrote a book called The Joy of Writing Sex, a guide for fiction writers. And it's not about writing erotica or pornography. But if you read a book by Toni Morrison or Joyce Carol Oates or Alice Walker or people like that, there are often sex scenes in those books, and there are sex scenes in many other books and more serious books, right? And so I wrote about how to write a sex scene in a sort of serious literary book, as opposed to a book that's intended to be pornographic or erotic. And it's been very, a lot of students of writing, there are a lot of MFA programs in the country, and a lot of students and teachers in those programs know about the book and talk about the book. I think it's helped sex scenes. I think sex scenes have gotten to be better written since I wrote that book.
Well, the title, The Joy of Writing Text, or excuse me, Sex.
Right. That was a publisher's idea. A publisher asked me to write that book.
Is that right? Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That's good publishers. I think that, I got left behind once upon a time in thinking I was going to be an author someday. Nevertheless, that's why I'm asking you to tell us all about your career.
Okay.
In your career, and the beat goes on, doesn't
it? Yeah. Well, I've just published my first memoir, full-length memoir. I've written a lot of memoiristic essays where I write about something in my life and try to connect it often to something larger. But I have written a lot about my life in short essays. But when I was diagnosed with lymphoma in 2017, fortunately, I'm okay now. I just want to assure everyone, and also people who are sick now with cancer. You can get better. I got better, but I want to just say that at the outset. But what I went through was so bizarre and difficult, not only with my health, but with the process of getting diagnosed and dealing with the medical establishment, what I call the medical industrial complex, that a friend of mine said to me, you have to write what happened to you because it will help many people. And people feel frustrated. They feel sometimes dismissed. There's something called medical gaslighting, where doctors, and it happens frequently to women and people of color, or more often to women and people of color, where a doctor will say, well, it sounds like anxiety. Your kid just left for college and that's why you can't sleep, or that's why you have night sweats. And this happens a lot. And a version of it happened to me when I found a lump in my armpit and went to the doctor immediately. And the doctor said, based on a sonogram, mismeasured, that it was a swollen lymph node and it would go down. And when it didn't go down, it took months to be diagnosed because of a series of mishaps, misdirection. Doctor went on summer vacation and sort of left me dangling. And no one was actively malevolent or bad, but I really had to be my own general contractor. I had to sort of figure out what to do next. Even though I'm in New York City, I had insurance. I'm a sort of savvy consumer. I was still really having to invent everything as I went along. And I think it's a very common experience. It's more common than we think.
How long did the little bumps in your arms, in your armpits, I should say, were they around? How long time?
Well, I first noticed them. I first felt a little weird sensation in my shoulder area for a few weeks. And it was just like a very vague sensation. I couldn't exactly say where it was. It was sort of around my shoulder. And I thought it was nothing. It didn't hurt. It didn't, it wasn't constant. And one night I just thought, oh, let me see what that is. And I put my hand into my armpit, and it was sort of like putting your hand in a light socket. It was like, oh my God, there's something there.
Right.
It was a really shocking moment. And I'd always been nervous. Of course, women tend to be very nervous about these things because we have to get mammograms every year. But I knew right away that it could be something serious and that I had to pay attention to it. And I went to the doctor the very next day, and I thought it would be resolved. I thought I'd know something, in a few days. And it took 3 months. And when I finally was diagnosed, and I was in a hospital I wasn't a patient in a hospital. I was an outpatient.
Uh-huh.
The doctor who did the biopsy and got it, he gave me the pathologist report that had the definite diagnosis. He gave it to me and he said, here's the name of the lymphoma doctor who runs our treatment program. Call him. Of course, being a good patient, I got home and he was the first person I called. And I was told his next appointment was in 2 months.
Oh,
So that was after 3 months of
yeah.
getting the runaround. And it was almost, I don't want to say it was funny, but it was almost funny. It was like, you must be kidding,
Yeah.
2 months.
Right.
This is a major hospital where I'd been a patient. Okay. I wasn't just walking in from nowhere. And I had just gotten a diagnosis of cancer. So fortunately, a very good friend had given me the name of a doctor who had treated her mother 15 years before. And my friend said, he's probably retired because he was on the older side then. And at that point, I needed to call somebody. And I looked up this doctor and he was not retired. He was about 78 years old.
Mhm.
And I called his office and he called me that night. And he
Really?
must have called me 10 times. I say in the book, he called me more often than my best friend did.
Yeah.
And so I went from what I call zombie medicine to the most attentive doctor in the world. And also he happened to be literally a legendary figure in the field of lymphoma and blood cancers. So I really lucked out very accidentally.
Well, I'm
So
going to have to a little bit of my past. When I was 14 years old, I determined or discovered that I had these little things in my armpits and behind my knees, things like that. And so we were all freaking out, Hodgkin's disease, this and that, and so forth. And then finally, they took a blood sample out of my sternum, and they said that you got to stop using that deodorant that you're
Oh
using.
my heavens.
Yeah,
Wow.
some deodorants are hard on you, and some are just great.
Right.
And so I
Right.
stopped using it. And guess what? They went away.
Wow. That's amazing that they could pinpoint that.
Mhm,
I
mhm.
mean, it's kind of it's fantastic. It
Yeah.
also speaks to the toxins that are in a lot of products that we take for granted.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself acting in a certain way about how you were thinking in the future? What your future's going to be like, that type of
Oh,
thing.
absolutely. Yeah. There was a moment sort of well into this when I was already getting chemo. So this was several months from the time I'm describing. When I came home from the hospital, from the doctor's office where I'd gotten some chemo, and I had a credit card, and it was a new credit card. And so it says, this is going to expire on this date. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, I wonder if I'm going to be here. It was like 2 or 3 years later. And I thought, am I going to outlast the credit card or is it going to outlast me? I didn't know. I just want to explain to people, I had what's considered a very treatable form of lymphoma. There are literally dozens of kinds of lymphoma. And the initial reading is that mine was very treatable. But then they do another level of testing these days called genetic testing. And I had a gene, or I have a gene, that the doctor said might make me resistant to chemo. And so that was the good news was that I had a treatable form of lymphoma. The bad news was I had this gene that might make me resistant to chemo. And so there was always an uncertainty about whether the chemo would work or whether it would continue to work. It did work. When I was in the hospital, it did work. The swollen lymph nodes or malignant lymph nodes went away, but the question is whether it's going to come back. And I was monitored very closely for 2 years and then 3 years. But the first 2 years, I think if you go for the first 2 years without a recurrence, your chances of it recurring go down. And then if you go 3 years without a recurrence, they go down farther. And I have touch wood, I think I'm at 5 years.
Oh,
So
fantastic.
feel
Fantastic.
very, very fortunate. I am very fortunate.
Right.
But my doctor kept saying, this is the legendary doctor. When he discovered this gene, he said, I'm spooked by this. He said, must have said it 15 times. I'm spooked by this. It was like, oh, well, if you're spooked, then I'm really spooked, and he wasn't sure how to treat me. And at one point he said, I'm going to a conference next week of lymphoma doctors, and there are going to be 1,000 doctors there, and I'm going to ask them what they would do.
999 of them.
I said, are you going to make an announcement to the whole room? He said, no, not like that. And I thought, well, that's kind of disappointing, But he came back and he said, the vote is 60-40, that you should, the first vote was like 50-50. Some doctors say you should go to the hospital and do chemo in the hospital, where you can get 5 continuous days, one type of chemo. So the question was whether I was going to do that for all of my chemo, which of course is very debilitating, or whether I would do some of the chemo in his office, what I call chemo al fresco, right? Because you could just sit and read magazines. And so the final vote on that was 60-40, that I should do the other treatments in his office. I didn't need to be in the hospital. So it was a very, and this was like the best doctor in the world. He was asking his friends what they would do. So it wasn't a barrel of laughs. Okay. But now I don't want to say I can see the humor in it, but I can see the dark humor in it. Right. It was kind of funny to think
there
about.
There is no humor. No humor.
There is no humor, but time plus tragedy can lead to humor. Right.
I was going to say that's the chemo. There's nothing there. Happy.
Right. Chemo was quite an experience. I'd never, of course, you hear about chemo all the time, but I'd never been close to somebody who was going through it, and I really didn't understand what it was all about. I didn't understand how it happened. It was just like a darkness for me. Even though I knew dozens of people who had had cancer. So it was quite an experience going through it and seeing how debilitating it was, and feeling the effects of it, and just how deadened you feel. And it was hard to imagine coming back from it. And I think one of the interesting things for me was that I did come back from it. I did get well.
Right.
And it gave me a feeling of resilience that I think I didn't have before. That's good. Very good. Yeah. So it was very, it's a profound experience to go through. It's not like, it's not like going out to eat. I mean, it's a much more, right. The menu is different. Yeah. The menu's very different. And it was shocking. And I think out of that, the book came out of my shock and out of my kind of, let's say, disbelief, or my or the changes I'd gone through, and also the difficulty I had just getting diagnosed. And I think if I had found this lump and I'd gone to the doctor, as I did, and it had gotten biopsied right away, and I'd gotten treated, I wouldn't have written a book. But I think I had so many encounters that were so distressing, and so strange, and in this thing that was really, it was like I kept saying, it's right here. I felt it all the time, and it wasn't like some rare cancer that was buried deep inside that nobody could find. It was like, I say at one point, it's like a plate of spaghetti and meatballs. It was right there. Right. And it just took all that time to figure it out for many reasons. But it is sore. They are sore. Mine wasn't sore. Really? Interesting. Well, there's another indication. Yeah, that is an indication. When you have a swollen lymph node, it's sore. When you have you get a cold, you have a swollen lymph node, it's sore. Right. But again, I don't want to practice medicine here but what I had was never sore. It never hurt. Now,
Good.
people who have lymphoma, maybe that's in their stomach,
Right.
or in other areas, that can be very painful. Okay, so
Right.
I don't want to say lymphoma doesn't hurt. I'm not in a position to say that, but the lymph node, the lymphoma that I had did not hurt.
What's the certain topic within that topic? How happy was it coming to you when you finally found that it's you're going to be around a while?
Well, it's great. I mean, there's nothing quite like it, right? I went to the doctor. I did something. I talk a lot about this a lot in the book. I was so afraid that I didn't really ask a lot of questions, and I knew that I was not always my best advocate, because I was so full of fear about what I'd find out. Right. And I don't advise it, but I also understand how hard it is to ask a million questions, because you could find out things you don't want to know. And I figured if I find out things I don't want to know, I'd rather just find them out when I have to find them out, right? But I went to the doctor about 6 months after, and he said, well, if it doesn't recur in 2 years, then you're really in good shape. And so when the 2-year mark came, I went to the doctor, and I sort of thought he'd say, well, it's good, it hasn't recurred. But he kind of ignored it. And then I thought, well, maybe I misheard him. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he said 5 years, and I was so nervous that I remember writing him an email and saying, so what do you think about this? Didn't you tell me it was 2 years? And he wrote back and he said, oh, yes, I think your prognosis is excellent. And I was like, oh, okay. Well,
but I'm still waiting.
I'm still waiting. One of the things I talk about in the book that really baffles me, or that's part of this whole process, is that doctors, they don't always tell you everything. No. And it's a little bit like kids who want to know where babies come from. Yeah. You say, well, you just tell them, you just answer it very simply. If they ask a question, you answer the question, but you don't go into detail. It's a little bit like that. Because some people don't want to know. A lot of people don't want to know the details. And I was one of them. Okay. Right. So I think doctors have trained themselves to only answer questions when they're asked. Right. Now, they may disagree with me, but that's my impression, right? They don't run off at the mouth and say, well, it could be this, it could be that, maybe it's this, maybe, they're very cautious. They seem to me very cautious.
Right. Okay? Because absolutely.
And there's no need to terrify a patient unless you have to, right? I mean, sure. So doctors have a lot of power. They're like the pilot in an airplane. If the pilot encounters something that looks a little dodgy, they're not going to get on the intercom and say, look, something really scary is up here and I'm really terrified, but I think everything's going to be fine, but don't worry. Okay. Good. They don't say that. They have to be cool. Right. And they only tell you things that you need to know. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that that's how they operate, unless you ask a lot of questions. But asking a lot of questions has its own drawbacks, right? Which is that you might hear something you don't want to know.
All those questions bring answers. Yeah, supposedly.
And the other thing that we all have to keep in mind is doctors don't know exactly what's happening. I mean, they might say, yeah, this looks one way and it could go this way, but it could go this way too. So it's very imprecise. Medicine is very imprecise. I mean, obviously, if you have something that's definitive and that's advanced and so forth, they might be able, if you've been a smoker and, or there are situations where they can be very definitive. But there are a lot of situations where they can't, and where things could go one way, but they could go another. And and the other thing that I think is really important for people to be aware of, which I wasn't that aware of. There are breakthroughs in cancer treatments all the time.
Right.
There are thousands of people working all over the world on treating cancer, on studying and treating cancer. And there are new treatments all the time. And even though a lot of people get diagnosed with cancer, a great many people benefit from these new treatments. And so you can have cancer and you can have breast cancer and live for 25 years, you know. So it's very different from 50 years ago, 20 years, even 20 or 30 years ago.
But now you've put that in the book. Is that right? In terms of what you've just described?
Well, I've talked about myself and my own fears about asking questions and sort of criticizing
And you still
myself.
had a sense of humor.
Yeah, one thing that people remark on a lot as they read the book is that the book is funny. And it's obviously not a funny story, but there were funny elements to it. When I was first told I had a swollen lymph node, I looked on the internet for natural remedies to cure swollen lymph nodes, and I did everything in abundance. I did jumping jacks. I ate wheatgrass juice. I drank Bragg apple cider vinegar, which is just awful. I drank gallons of turmeric tea. And I put hot compresses in my arm. I did everything I could to shrink this, what I was told was a swollen lymph node. And so I make fun of myself doing those things, right? And I kind of, I want to say I make fun of myself. I mock my own fears sometimes.
Right.
And so the book is told, the story is told in little short sections with funny titles. And so it's not a number of people have said it's like reading a whodunit, or more like a thriller rather than reading. It's not a ponderous book to read about illness.
Well, it's entertaining, of course. Where do you, I guess for my listeners, they'd like to know where they can find your book.
They can find the book at all kinds of online bookstores like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org. You can probably find it at your local bookstore. You can get a list of, you can Google my name and the book. So my name is Elizabeth Benedict. The book is called Rewriting Illness. And you can go to my website, elizabethbenedict.com, and read some of the reviews. You can read articles that I've written about the subject, and you can get links to some of the places where you can buy the book.
Well, that's great.
And you can write to me also. My email address is on my website, and I love hearing from people.
Right. No stone unturned. It's been a pleasure having you today on my show.
Thank you. Same here.
I'm glad that, well, we try to make it fun,
yeah.
Just to make sure that I didn't cry once.
I'm glad. I'm really glad.
Let's see. Oh, my adios. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Searching for integrity. So long and happy trails to all.